school fund bank account. It was just, I mean, it was perfect timing because I had just sent an email to my staff yesterday and said, when are we going to get that 121 million? And the answer was sometime in April. And then this morning it was sometime within the week. And then a couple minutes later it was, we got it today. So that's what Elliott's been like, lots of hard work, and then we can celebrate. There's a lot of work awaiting us. I think we all noted that in the comments. I think even Melissa had some comments about that today. And I think I've lost all credibility with you folks. If I ever come to you again and say, could you serve on a committee for a year? Just run, because it won't be for a year. And I apologize for that. But I think in your heart, you knew it was going to take longer than a year. It took us a year to really get to know one another and to be able to work well together. And there were a lot of things that needed to be worked out. And as you know, there were many moments where it just seemed like, I give up, this is too hard. But there's change ahead, and the transitions that Malia and Jeff talked about today in front of the land board still need to take place. And so while I only asked you to serve for a year and it's been 3, I need you all to stay with me until the December land board. There are some pretty critical things, as you saw today, that were outlined on the spreadsheet that need to be done. While we have kind of decoupled because the money got dropped into our account, there is still an appraisal outstanding. There's still an Fmp outstanding. There's still a lot of work left to be done. So if you can all just hunker down and hang with me until December, that would be great. At that time, I would suspect that some of you will continue on in the transition to the new authority and want to stay deeply involved. Others may want to just step back and say, thank you so much. You'll be my lifelong friend. I'll write Christmas cards to you, but I kind of have other things to do. And we're getting ready to go into a long special session next year. So that's what I'm asking as we go into this new chapter, is just to help me and my team and Oregon Consensus and all of us to get to the goal, to get to the end line. And I don't know, if you're soccer, you put it into the net. If you're football, you get it across the goal line. If you're some other sport, you do something else. But that, whatever analogy you come up with, December is our goal. And so I hope that you're all going to hang with us until December. And don't make any huge plans for your summer, because there's a lot to do in the summer. Say that in all sincerity, and I'm leaving in September for 10 days to go to New York City. It's been on my husband's bucket list for a lifetime, and he's 72 this year, and the opportunities are starting to slip away. So I will be gone for 10 days in September. But other than that, I'm with you. So anyway, my sincere thanks. It was tremendous to see it today, to see it all come together. And I've got my pen. Are you writing with yours, Paul? You're supposed to keep it as a keepsake. Oh, that's your old
in my
pen.
Briefcase. He's got mine.
Oh, all right. Okay. Well, anyway, let's celebrate today, but there's work to do now. So Peter, back to you to tell us all the work we have left to do.
Yeah, I feel almost bad making you all stay for a meeting.
I've got a question
Uh-huh.
right off the bat.
Yeah.
The money's in the bank.
Yeah.
The money's been, so that's $220 million total.
221.
221.
I believe.
Why are you doing an appraisal?
Jeffrey?
Why, thank you, Paul.
Is there a possibility that there will be more money coming?
The appraisal that was done in 2016 is dated, and it has been pointed out that that's the case. And there have been a few events that have happened that were not accounted for in that appraisal that have happened since. One is that there was a Supreme Court decision on trust responsibilities, and the other is the fact that there's going to be an HCP. And then, of course, there's been some timber that's grown since 2016 to 2022. So the decision was made that we needed to update that appraisal. So that's what we're doing. And it's on the agenda to talk about in a little bit, but
Yes, I'm confused.
yeah.
An adjustment?
The fundamental basis for the appraised value of the forest is different today than it was in 2016 because of, in particular, the Supreme Court decision. And that's a legitimate issue that we felt like we needed to incorporate into the current appraised value that would be the basis for a decoupling decision.
Does that answer your question?
Well, it will create more and more questions.
Well,
I'll save those for later.
okay, well, it was the same answer I would have given you that Jeff gave you, and it's just that it's an old dated appraisal, and I think we have a fiduciary responsibility to update it.
Bob, do you have something on, do you guys want to, is it on the same topic?
Yeah, I mean, I just want my understanding though is it doesn't go down, it can only go up. Is that correct?
I don't know what the appraised value is.
No, not the appraisal, but the contribution to the common school.
There's been a commitment of $221 million on the,
We have the money and we ran with it, so they can't get it back.
So that was the question. It
There's no
can,
take
it
backs.
can go up, but that's the baseline that we're working from is the 221.
that's been the basis for the conversations we've been involved in.
Okay.
Mary asked me before the meeting started if we'd like a receipt.
You can hang that one on your wall. So with that, and we'll see a little bit more of that as we get into sort of work plan and when those, appraisals are, information's going to come out, et cetera, as we get further into the meeting. Here's what to expect for the meeting. And with due apologies from taking you from a celebratory, exciting feel to, okay, let's get down to work. But in some ways it's fitting because there's good reason to celebrate today. And as many of you have said, there's also a lot of work ahead of us. So, so fitting to sort of roll up our sleeves now for a couple hours together. So we've got an update from Malia on legislative overview and discussion. I think it's really to just make sure many of you track the legislative process very closely, others maybe not as closely. And so we just want to make sure everybody's kind of on the same page in terms of what happened during the session and what the legislation says. Shannon and the team are going to give an overview of the FMP process and kind of where things are and updates on what's happening and what's to be expected going forward on the FMP. As Vicki noted, there's a lot that's going to happen, particularly on the FMP over the course of the summer and that's been happening over the last few months. So we have some updates on that. Brandon has joined us today to give a bit of a kind of a presentation on some of the data and research that is underway and LiDAR and how that's being used, et cetera. So we have some time until about 2:35 for him to give a presentation on that and for folks to ask questions, have some interactions, kind of give you a flavor of some of the data and information that's being utilized by the college as they develop the FMP and think about research objectives in carbon and whatnot going forward. We'll give you a break. And then we have other work updates sort of, and this is sort of what to expect for the December land board meeting, what's going on in the HCP, and then the financial analysis. So that's also related to the FMP, but want to make sure folks are kind of aware of that. And then for members of the public that are, I think, either here in person, I don't think we have any members of the public here in person, but if you're joining us via Zoom, you can send Jenna a chat during the meeting and we'll make sure to get you in the queue for public comment. And I promise to get you out of here no later than 3:40 and look forward to the rest of the afternoon. So with that said, Any questions about the agenda? Any general updates, things that aren't on the agenda, pertinent to the discussion, things that folks should just be aware of? All right, Malia, Yeah.
Financials on there.
flip the page. Malia,
Oh, I didn't see it.
do you want to just come right here? You're good? Okay.
I'm gonna keep myself. Do have this so that the folks online can hear me as well. So as Peter said, I'm going to walk through the bill that was passed, its final version, just so that everyone kind of gets a sense of what was incorporated into the bill, and so that we're kind of all working off of the same page moving forward. Ted, do you mind going ahead and putting that slide up on the screen, please? While he's loading that, I will, again, because I don't think it's redundant yet, just thank everybody for your incredible dedication, the amount of time that was put into specifically drafting the concept that would become Senate Bill 1546. I know that there were 6 advisory committee members who, really put in some extra time there, but I know that it's something that really everyone in this room, advisory committee members plus, were a part of that process. And, I think it's a fun process. That's why, that's the bulk of my job description, but I know that that's not the case for everyone. So thanks for all your work creating Senate Bill 1546. When Jeff and I and Peter and the advisory subgroup and OSU were putting things together, I was very, very adamant that this is a short session. We don't get to amend this bill. If there's something you want in here, please let us know now. This was like October for a February session. And we were very stern that there were not going to be amendments. So I'm now going to walk you through the amended version of the bill that came through the February session, because there were a couple of changes that were made. So what I have on the screen is essentially it is a table of contents. And so if you were to go look at the bill section by section, this is what is, these are the contents of the Elliott State Research Forest Bill. So section 1, there's a definition of forest management plan, because we do refer to a forest management plan throughout the bill. And as many of you know who have read or written or worked off of statutes before, definitions really matter in this case. So section 1 is a definition of a forest management plan. Section 2 is kind of where we really get into the meat of things. And as I said at the land board meeting, this is where the mission and management policies that were very highly negotiated among the folks in this room show up. If anyone was looking really closely at the land board slides, you'll notice that there were 10 topics listed under management policies. And you can see there where it says 11 management policies for the forest. That's because the mission statement is that 11th piece. So with the mission statement and the management policies, you have 11 priorities that were identified by the advisory committee to be included in statute to be kind of the foundational management direction for the Elliott's future. We also did incorporate the mention of the 4 foundational documents, defined those, and did codify that changes to those documents in the future need to go through a public process, and that any policy or management changes to any of those documents in the future do have to remain in alignment with the mission and management policies found here in section 2. Section 3 outlines the land board's responsibilities to define the Elliott State Forest boundaries that will become the Elliott State Research Forest. Section 4 is where we put the research forest proposal, OSU's research forest proposal. We did call that out as a foundational document. So that's now mentioned in statute and says that that's a university document and they're charged with the management and housing of it. Section 5, 6, and 7. This is where we start talking about the board of directors. So essentially the newly established Elliott State Research Forest Authority. That's going to operate as a board of directors that will be 7 or 9 members. And then OSU will be a permanent non-voting member on that board as well. You can go into these sections and look at the details of terms, appointment criteria, et cetera. And all of this is very much in detail on the Oregon Legislative Information System. So if you go into OLS, do make sure that you go to session 2022 and search for Bill 1546, and you can pull this up and look at all of the details. Section 8 requires that board of directors to give an annual report to the land board for the first 6 years that the board is operational. After that, it goes to every other year. Section 9 talks about land board oversight. So kind of the role of the land board over the forest into the future. They will be more of an oversight advisory position, giving policy advice rather than being the final decision-making body. And then section 4 talks about university, I'm sorry. I lost myself here going between the 2 pages. Section 10. So on the board of directors, there's an executive director. So section 10 talks about the executive director's responsibilities. Section 11 actually calls out the authority as an agency, the activities that they are authorized to do as an agency. So essentially gives them operational authority. Section 12, authorization to reimburse expensive for employees and board members. Section 13 is how and where Oregon APA provisions apply to the decision-making process. Section 14 talks about the expansion and exchange of lands, should those occur. Section 15, and starting here, we get into some very kind of standard run-of-the-mill language that you'll see anytime a new agency is established. So section 15, along with the establishment of an Elliott State Research Forest Authority, there is established an Elliott State Research Forest account. Sections 16 through 21 refer to the new agency's revenue bonding authority. Oh, yeah, sorry. Ted, can you scroll up? Thank you. There we go. Section 23 is the certificates of participation financing adjustments. The certificates of participation, many of you will remember that was the original 100 million that was deposited on behalf of the Elliott State Forest, which will now be the Elliott State Research Forest. And there are statutes on the books right now for those certificates of participation. Once they've run its course, then the statute or the reference to the Elliott will be updated. Sections 24 through 30 are all of the places in Oregon statute that refer to the Elliott State Forest will now go through and either be deleted or the reference be updated to the Elliott State Research Forest. So that's all of those sections are just statutory cleanup. Section 31 is the operative dates section, and this is the section that includes the sunset provisions and talks about the delayed implementation status that Jeff talked about a little more in detail in front of the land board earlier today. Section 32 requires a report to the Legislative Assembly. Pardon me. And then sections 33 and 34 are very much just standard form language and closure of any bill that is passed. I'm going to point out really quickly, if you go back up to section 16 through 21, you'll see a little yellow asterisk that's highlighted. one of the amendments that was made, and it was made kind of in the final days right before the bill was passed, it was actually made by the Legislative Budgeting and Revenue Office. There was essentially an unnecessary extraneous revenue reference in section 22, and they requested that we remove it. So they went ahead and removed section 22 and then didn't bother to renumber the rest of the sections. And so it just goes section 21 to 23 because one was stricken by a legislative office as a technical update. So those are, at a high level, the contents of the bill. So if anyone has any questions about any of those sections, Jeff is happy to answer those for you. And again, you can always go and review this bill in detail on OLS. I just wanted to make sure that collectively as an advisory committee, you had an opportunity to see what the full contents of the bill were before we went ahead and moved forward with our work. So does anyone have any questions other than Paul? No, nobody? Okay, Paul, go ahead.
Actually, there's one part of this that got added. And that's the fact that executive director. It's going to make it really hard to hire the quality person. It was pointed out to me by no, that's not it. Line. What? It is.
Mhm.
Yeah, that.
So I did. I was okay. I was just going to say, I do want to make sure that it is a 4-year term, but there's no term limit. So their term can continue. So they can serve for 8 years or, but so it's a term, but there's not a term limit attached to the executive director's seat.
Yeah, and that was added as part of the standard language. That's pretty much the way all directors of state agencies are configured. Instead of on a year-to-year appointment, they are there's a term of 4 years and then that gets renewed. It could have been something different, but they took the kind of the standard language out of all of the agencies, that the natural resource agencies, and inserted it. We didn't ask for it. And I don't, it's an interesting question because it doesn't preclude a board from dismissing a director for cause or because things aren't working out before a term ends. And it also doesn't preclude the board from going through some formal process at the end of the 4-year term to start going, to renew. But I understand your concern.
Both ends were in. That it's looks like a 4-year position. The inverse of that is you hire someone that interviews really well and they turn out to get good. Are you stuck with them for 4 years?
You're not, at least in the context of state agency world and directors, most certainly not.
Correct.
We serve at the will. We're at will employees.
Yeah, and because it's a state agency, it would be treated exactly the same as Vicky's position or the head of water resource department or the OWEB or the forester, state forester. It's a position at will that's renewable on a 4-year cycle. University, I think it's on annual contracts and for some positions. Not with tenure, but for some administrative, at least.
No, we went away from that.
Okay, well, that's since I left. But it doesn't preclude, at least in agency land, a departure before the 4 years is over or continuation.
So I know, Mark, you've got a question, a quick reminder to folks. We're getting chats that if you're not speaking into the microphone, people are having a hard time hearing you. So just a reminder to do that.
Okay. Before we go on to Mark's question, the second piece of the answer there that I do want to make sure that folks are hearing too is that there were several pieces as we were setting up the new authority that Ledge Council did. The direction was we want this to be just like every other state natural resources agency. So there are some of those decisions that where it comes from, the decision, whether it's a 4-year term or other things, is because that's what you'll find when you look across Oregon's other natural resource agencies. And we wanted them to be, established the same. So.
Yeah, and Paul was the one that pointed it out. I had not noticed that that was in there until you, to me.
I didn't know.
You've got mine.
I didn't notice it. It was pointed out to someone that asked me about it.
Thanks for the question. Mark?
Yeah, just Vicky, a clarification question when you're talking about, asking all of us to stay on through December, because then potentially new people would be appointed to the authority. Just what's the timing of it? Is the governor really going to appoint people to the new authority beginning in January, or is that a little more fluid than that maybe?
Jeff, we talked about that yesterday.
We did.
Remind me what we talked about.
We haven't made a decision, but there's clear that the board does not come into existence until the agency comes into existence on January 1st, 2024.
That was
But there is an option to consider of shaping the advisory committee to over time begin to reflect more and more what the board composition would look like as an on-ramp to when the agency actually is starting, so that there's not an abrupt, it was one way before, it's a different way the next day. And so that's just something that we've started kicking around as things we should be thinking about this year and the lead up to the December land board meeting.
Thanks.
Any other questions, comments?
I'll do one real quick, and kudos to Paul for catching that, but I'd suggest that when there is an application process or a hiring process for the first 4-year general manager, it probably makes sense to note as Vicky's pointed out, that doesn't preclude somebody from being let go for cause or a renewal of contract, and it's standard agency admin. So folks potentially considering applications would understand that it's not necessarily.
And is the executive director an employee of OSU? No, of the authority.
Of the authority.
Okay.
No, employee of the state.
Yeah, just in response to Jeff, I think it's a really good idea to start to get the board, whatever it's going to be in place, even if we all stay involved, especially if there's going to be some new folks. I'm serving on a board of a newly created agency right now that just came into existence a few years ago, and it's taken a really long time to get people up to speed, especially as it's in its formation. And I think that could be a huge challenge. So I like that idea of trying to ease into that with the time we have.
Okay.
Thanks for the questions and helpful reflections. And Malia for the overview, much appreciated. As we transition to the FMP overview, I want to take just a second. I know we have a number of members of the public that joined us. We'll take public comment at the end. If you wish to provide public comment or have a note or something, send it directly to Jenna. We've got a number of different folks that are kind of co-hosting, and the easiest way for tracking comments from the public or suggestions is directly to Jenna, and we're sitting next to each other so we can address those as possible. And then knowing we're going into the FMP discussion, Tom DeLuca, I know you've joined us via Zoom. I wondered if we might want to do an audio check with you in case questions come up and you want to chime in.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Quick audio check. I'm sorry I'm not there with you all. I tested positive for COVID a couple days ago, and so yeah. Anyhow, really sad I wasn't there with you all, but looks like things happened. The signing happened, and really, what a wonderful celebration. So congratulations, everybody, and now time to get to work.
We saved a pen for you, Tom.
And you were missed.
Thank you, Vicki.
We can hear you well, so thanks. Glad you could join us this way.
Okay. Okay.
With that, Shannon, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Jenna, do I need a clicker? I'll just pull the slides up here in a minute. Can everyone hear me okay? Should I move this closer? A little closer. Okay.
Still there.
Oh.
I'm lost in myself, so. Good job.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all. It's great to be with you here in person and meet many of you for the first time in person, which is just amazing after the past few months working with you all on this project. The OSU team today wanted to give an update on the forest management planning process, including just a general process overview and then a look at the priority draft sections that we're working on for the December land board meeting, and then a look at content development in a range of specific areas that are linked with those priority sections. So first, to start with a process overview, and I'll apologize in the beginning, there are a lot of slides here that are text heavy, but I just wanted to make sure that all these details are captured for you here to follow along with, and then also to refer to if you wish after the meeting. So we'll start with the process overview, which includes the groups that are contributing to data collection and analysis, compiling information, content development, and FMP drafting. And so we've been assembling science technical groups and working at this stage with individuals within those groups to outline the frameworks that act as the foundation for further group input and refinement. And that includes additional data that we're bringing into the process. So we've been interacting with members of the FMP working group of this advisory committee, as well as researchers from OSU and other institutions, tribes, and local communities to bring together people to form these groups. And while we've been going through that process, we've been working with individuals within these groups to put together the foundational documents and outlines that will form the discussion for the full group. And so really what we're trying to do there is make sure that we're efficient with time, that we're gathering all of the resources that we've been able to put together so far, and add updated information where we have it for full group input and discussion. And so with these science technical groups, three of the main contributions to the FMP are determining the frameworks and decision-making spaces for specific areas of the forest management plan, as well as outlining experimental designs. And we'll get into the details of those in a little bit here. Second is incorporating information developed by individuals within these groups or other FMP teams into the materials and the drafts that are being developed for the forest management plan. And then third is contributing content and writing directly to the FMP sections. So as I said, we'll talk about the work of those science technical teams more in detail today. The Elliott State Research Forest financial analysis, which is an important part of the forest management plan and the foundation for the ESRF. Work on the financial analysis includes input from a specific technical group, as well as additional input from contractors, OSU and DSL, and coordination between OSU and DSL on the financial assessment and third-party review. And we'll also be talking about that process a little bit more today. And then closely related to these pieces of the process is coordination with DSL on other Elliott State Research Forest aspects related to the FMP, which includes the Habitat Conservation Plan, startup funds, talking about facilities and communications. And that's something that we'll be talking about later during the Research Forest Work Update section. Looking at FMP drafting. So FMP drafting is in progress and involves synthesizing information from several areas, including incorporating information that has already been compiled from other source documents. This includes the 2011 Elliott State Forest Management Plan, the ESRF research proposal, the Habitat Conservation Plan, as well as a range of other resources that we've been gathering. It also involves integrating outputs from the science technical groups as draft products are finalized from each of those groups. We have added a technical writer to the forest management plan team, and I'll talk a little bit more about him in a bit, but he is taking a lead role on this effort and coordinating closely with our core team and helping to bring all of these resources together in one voice as part of the forest management plan. So several major milestones in drafting the FMP are listed here. This is the high level overview. So these are not the full list of milestones and dates. We have spoken with members of the FMP working group, as I mentioned, who will be incorporated in these science technical groups as they come together in May through August. And the public engagement that we have planned as part of this process will align over the summer. The work of these science technical groups and our core team at OSU contributes directly to content development and FMP drafting, and drafts of key sections will be shared by September 1st for input at the September advisory committee meeting that's being scheduled. Input from the advisory committee and science and stakeholder communities will then be incorporated into the drafts between September and November 1st. And those materials will be finalized by November 1st so that they can be ready for presentation at the State Land Board meeting in December. And then you can see with an eye on that final timeline of July 1st, 2023 in the legislation, the final FMP would be completed by June 2023. So this is a snapshot of the priority sections we're targeting as drafts for presentation at that December 2022 State Land Board meeting. This list is based on input from the core forest management plan team, advisory committee members, and other stakeholders. And content development for these sections in particular has been an important part of what we've been focusing on for the past couple of months as we've been working on bringing together additional data and drafts towards this FMP. So you can see the full list up here. Of course, beginning with the forest management plan goals and objectives, looking at conservation strategies, both for the species covered in the habitat conservation plan, as well as a multi-species approach. And part of this is outlining that marbled murrelet experiment that was a part of the research proposal. Triad experimental design and early implementation. So this is an area, as we've talked about before, that looks at the experimental design that was laid out in the research proposal, any refinements that we're making at this stage, and then really focusing on early implementation. So the forest management plan identifying the early implementation watersheds where work would begin in the first years of the Elliott State Research Forest. Another key section here is forest management strategies and harvest operations, aligning with the different areas of the Triad approach for intensive silviculture, extensive silviculture, ecological forestry, the restoration treatments and reserves, adaptive silviculture for climate change, and our post-disturbance response in different areas of the forest. An aquatic and riparian section with a piece also focused on the riparian restoration experiment. The financial analysis, as we mentioned, being a key section. the adaptive management strategy, a draft monitoring plan, and then the framework and process for recreation and public access, and then also education and outreach. And as we've also discussed before, and this is laid out in the legislation, there are separate plans that will be developed for recreation and public access and for education and outreach. And so the forest management plan is really in those sections, looking at the process for developing those plans, as well as the framework. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later today as well.
Shannon, can I just stop there for a second? Because this is an important piece. And I just want to make sure from the advisory committee, is this consistent with what you were thinking of when you thought of what are the priority sections and what would be developed in those? If there's something that's missing, it'd be important to hear that.
Thanks for this. Yeah, I guess I'd just say that without seeing a little bit more than this, it's hard to say. Like when I think about the aquatic and riparian strategy chapter, I imagine something that, you know, characterizes the species that are present, the values that are there, the methods for stream typing that are going to be used, the distances from different stream types that will be, et cetera. So I envisage more of that than the riparian restoration experiment, which seems like a kind of a small subset potentially of the aquatic and riparian strategy. So anyway, for me at least, I'll be looking for that more robust sort of typical chapter that you see in a forest management plan, which is probably like what's in the HCP or some of the old FMPs that the state has pursued.
Shannon, do you want to?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Bob. And so you're absolutely right. That little sub-bullet of the riparian restoration experiment is not meant to denote that that's the focus of that section. And so all of that information that you just mentioned, as well as thinking about our pre and post-treatment monitoring connections to that section, that will all be in that aquatic and riparian section. So that restoration experiment is just a small subset of it.
Pardon me, that's great. I'll just add that at some point it helped me, I think, just to see like a draft table of contents, like an expanded table of contents with all the different
Sub bullets.
Yeah, like the 1.1, the 1.111, et cetera. Not fleshed out yet, but just to sort of frame up, here's what's going to be in these sections. Thanks.
Thanks. Bob Salinger.
Yeah, I think two things. One is I appreciate the timeline. I just want to flag that as something that we remain concerned about just because time, I mean, all the dates are still in front of us, but time is moving pretty quickly. And we've had a tough time with the FMP really getting it geared up. So I appreciate all your work on that. But I just want to flag that, you know, September is coming fast. So, and summer is hard to schedule too. As far as this goes, you and I have talked about this offline, so I don't want to belabor it today, but I think that multi-species issue, I just want to flag that because I think it is important that this covers other listed species like the coastal martin specifically, as well as Oregon conservation strategy species that are in the forest as well. So things like stream dwelling amphibians, mussels, other species that are of concern, I think should have sections in here. They don't have to necessarily be terribly long, but how are we going to approach those species that weren't addressed through the HCP?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up those points, Bob. And as you said, you and I have discussed this a bit and would welcome the opportunity to continue those discussions. And part of what we're doing on that piece right now is we've had conversations with ODFW and sort of coordinating with them on what resources are available, as well as the researchers and practitioners that we're bringing in on the monitoring plan as well. And we talked about a couple of those people. So that is definitely one of the areas that we're keying in on is looking at the strategy for those species that were not covered under the HCP and making sure that we're working with the resources that we have here across the state to make sure those are covered.
Thanks, Shannon. Let me go Ken and then Mark, and then we'll go back to the presentations. Go ahead, Ken.
Thanks, Peter. A caution, I guess, or maybe just a comment, but it's good to see now that we have recreation, public access, education, outreach, those things which I sent an email to Shannon and kind of, questioned about the things that were under the line, if you will, on the previous graphic from last meeting. I just want to caution the group that we know we are going to have framework. We know that recreation, education, those subjects are not going to be covered explicitly in the forest management plan. The caution is that we make sure we get those plans for those separate entities in a timely manner, because the public is absolutely going to be interested, especially in the recreation piece, fairly soon. So that's all I had.
Thanks, Ken. And Shannon, do you want to mention a little bit of the thoughts related to June and potential for having some engagement around that?
Yeah, I can either do that now, or I've got a couple slides towards the end.
Do it during the slides and a little bit, Mark. Go.
Yeah, hi, thanks Shannon for the presentation. Just a question or maybe an observation, but I know the financial analysis is coming up and we'll talk more about it yet today. But at least in the first 20 years, I believe a lot of the focus on the treatments is in the restoration treatments in the reserve. So I guess I'm wondering on the timing, it seems like the strategies or the silvicultural treatments that are going to be proposed in those reserves will have to come forward pretty quick to inform the pairing of the financial analysis. Or I guess I'm asking a question, is that how they're coming together? Or are they not?
Yeah, and actually,
if that's going to get answered in the financial analysis, that's fine. We can that thought, if you will.
That's a great question, and it might maybe if I go to the next slide, it might help illustrate some of these things. So this looks familiar probably to those who were at the Fmp working group meeting in March with a couple of updates. This is just a visual representation of the work that's going on in some of these areas that we're calling these science technical groups. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a representation from a range of expertise, including OSU, other academic institutions, agencies, tribes, and the members from the Fmp working group. And so one of the things that we wanted to talk about today is some of the connections between those groups, because that's a really key part of the work that's happening. There are a lot of individuals involved with this project. And so in order to make sure that that information from one group is connecting with another group, with the people who are involved, and that we're able to bring this information together in a way that's targeted towards the Fmp. We thought it would be helpful to look at some of the connections. And so if, for example, we're looking at the financial analysis, there are basically connections to all of these groups and the work that's going on there. So we have a financial analysis that was conducted as part of the research proposal in 2019 and 2020, working with Mason, Bruce, and Gerard. As you're all aware, we have a financial analysis technical group that's been meeting several times throughout the past couple of months to really dig into that information. And this is on another slide as well, further in the presentation. But that group has really been looking at the modeling that was done, the assumptions built into that model, and then looking at the information that we have now about projections, revenue, silvicultural and harvest costs, as well as the research and operations costs that have been projected for the forest, and making sure that we are covering all the categories that need to be covered, as well as that we are making sure to conduct sensitivity analyses, and that we're truly capturing what the projected costs are. And so in addition to that work, there are inputs from these other groups that are also feeding into the financial analysis. So one is the monitoring plan. As we are drafting the different sections of the monitoring plan and looking at pilot studies on the forest, some of the things that we're considering here are what's the cost of monitoring equipment, of sensors, of study plots? What is the cost of analyzing that data? And then what is the cost of making that data accessible through our data management systems? And so that piece is also now going into the financial analysis with more detail. Another piece is the landscape analysis and modeling. And we're going to talk about a lot of these, the work that's going on in these different groups here in a minute. But looking from a landscape scale with the information that we have now from the 2021 LiDAR that was flown and that we were just able to start working with at the beginning of March, using that updated picture of what's currently on the forest in the financial analysis as well. Same with aquatic and riparian systems, and that also links to the monitoring program. Same with the Triad experimental design and the initial projections in the research proposal based on the different silvicultural treatments and how those were modeled. So we're working on refining those as part of this experimental design. The restoration experiment, so to get to your question, Mark, this is another piece that also feeds into updated information for the financial analysis. So in the modeling work that has been done so far, this restoration experiment is captured through different modeling scenarios, but happening within the first 20 years, because that's a one-time entry. And then after that, that piece goes away. So that does factor into the financial analysis as well as for that time horizon, but then also what would a thinning look like in those areas? And then what would the harvest revenue be expected, as well as the silvicultural costs. So all those details help refine the financial analysis more. So that's a piece that's happening right now. Same with extensive silviculture and species conservation strategy. And a big piece of this, of course, is the habitat conservation plan and monitoring, as well as the research and monitoring for a multi-species strategy. So you can see that there is work that has been done on the financial analysis through the research proposal and through the FMP and the financial analysis technical group, but there's also pieces from all of these other areas that are contributing to more detailed information on the financial analysis. So we can take a look at that snapshot of the financial analysis at any point in time and then understand what information we are expecting to continue to add to that in the next couple of months as these other pieces continue to be developed, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So just looking at another example, real quick, if we're looking at the monitoring plan, a piece of this that's feeding in is data collection, as well as refinements to the experimental design, the species conservation strategy, aquatic and riparian systems, and an interplay with the data management systems that are being developed. And one of the questions that we've been exploring with a team that we've been working with at the H.J. Andrews, as well as in the College of Engineering, is what type of system can we build? What is the cost, dollar-wise and capacity-wise to maintain that system? What's needed for the monitoring plan? And the really exciting thing that we've been talking about is this is a pretty unique opportunity to build something like this from the ground up, and not many places have that. But with all of this, it's important to keep in mind the needs of the monitoring plan, the needs of the data management system, and the fact that it's public facing and needs to be accessible, and then the financial analysis and the funding that it takes to support that system. So just wanted to give a quick snapshot of how all of these pieces are coming together and how they relate to each other before digging into the details of what's happening at each of these stages, because you can draw arrows between any one of these bubbles, and all of the groups are sort of building on each other. So that's where we are right now with the FMP. Okay, so looking at the Triad experimental design, two of the main outputs here are finalizing the proposed treatment allocation for the Triad design, including the partial watersheds, and identifying those locations for early implementation. And so one of the things that we've been working on here is developing criteria for the watersheds so that we can identify the full suite of potential watersheds that could be included in early implementation. And so some of the things we've been considering are the approach for this, considering subwatersheds that are closest to the experimental target condition, so that we can learn from those first before applying those lessons learned to other areas of the forest. Looking at slope aspect and elevation, identifying subwatersheds on both sides of the fog line, which runs almost exactly through the middle of the forest, cutting the forest in half. Human values, society values for the forest, overlay of northern spotted owl and marbled murrelet designated habitat, as well as the riparian conservation area. Integration with the aquatic and riparian strategy, including looking at important characteristics of fish-bearing streams that we want to key in on for early implementation, as well as looking at non-fish-bearing streams, and in particular for the restoration experiment, looking at Douglas fir plantations in those non-fish-bearing stream reaches that are less than 65 years old, and then looking at a degree of fragmentation. And part of what is happening now with these criteria is starting to identify this full list of subwatersheds that would be potentials for early implementation. We've gotten feedback from members of this advisory committee as well about areas that we should be aware of and look at more closely. And so the next steps here are to bring together that full technical group to really identify within this suite of potential subwatersheds, and using a list of criteria, where do we think we want to start first? Another piece of work going on here is in the spatial analysis is boundary adjustments to match the landscape. And this is largely based on the 2021 LIDAR, those minor adjustments. So this slide at the top says 2022 field season and data collection. So from that map of all of the groups, there was a bubble on data collection that was closely linked to several areas, including the monitoring plan. And so as we've been developing these criteria and conducting analyses, primarily spatial analysis and looking at some forest inventory work through LIDAR, we've also been planning a 2022 field season to collect targeted information where we really need more detail in order to make decisions based on the list of criteria that we have. And so one area here is looking at forest inventory. We are putting together a summer team of field techs. And one of the main areas that they're going to be looking at is accurate data on tree age, stand age, structural characteristics for habitat and understory vegetation in areas of the forest where we just don't have a clear history of management and disturbance. Another piece here, which we mentioned at the Fmp working group meeting, is disturbance history and stand age. There's a group from OSU led by James Johnston, Andrew Merschel, and Matt Riley that's looking at a coarse grain regional fire history using stump cross sections and fire scars. And then within that sort of larger grid in the lower Umpqua, looking at age structure on the Elliott in a series of study plots. We are also working with another team on a pilot study for forest carbon measurements using band dendrometers that would then be built on in the monitoring plan. In addition to these pieces that are in place for the summer, we're also exploring additional opportunities, including integration between the upland data collection that we have here and aquatic and riparian systems. And one of the areas that the aquatic and riparian team is targeting is looking at preliminary measurements to determine where weir locations should be on the forest. We have another group that's looking at microbial communities, including the potential to do a pilot study on canopy diversity this summer. So looking at setting up a series of plots on both sides of the fog line and having a tree climber go up into the canopy and get a sense of the diversity that's across the forest. And that will also help inform more of the details of the monitoring plan. And then we also have a team that's working on a landslide inventory. On the landscape analysis and modeling piece, we have two teams who are working on this. One is based out of University of Oregon, and they're working with a model called Landis 2. And then there's a team here, or a team at OSU working on Island, and Bogdan Strimbu is here today to talk a little bit more about that work and applications to the Elliott. Both of these models are in the process of model parameterization and calibration, and then will be able to be used for analysis as part of the overall efforts and the data that we're collecting from these other areas. Bogdan's team in the Mars lab is also doing a forest inventory work using that 2021 LiDAR, both aerial and terrestrial, some high resolution images and ground validation. And I'll let him talk a little bit more about those details. And that data will contribute to multiple areas of the FMP, including the landscape analysis, the monitoring plan, the design of silvicultural treatments, and experimental design. So as this new data becomes available, it'll be folded into the conversations that are happening around each of these areas. Development of the monitoring plan has several layers, including identifying the network of permanent and temporary plots, monitoring equipment, and survey types that will form the backbone of the Elliott State Research Forest research program, particularly around 4 areas: carbon and climate, aquatic and riparian systems, wildlife and biodiversity, and social science and recreation. Determining the information needed to support decision-making points in the experimental design and the forest operations and the adaptive management strategy is an important part of this. And so the monitoring work that's currently happening is looking at creating a network of monitoring plots that we can then build on. And so we're working with science technical groups based on this biodiversity plot network work that's happened at the H.J. Andrews, as well as through a recently funded NIFA proposal. And you can see a diagram here of what these plots look like from the air. This is work that Matt Betts, Tal Levy, and their team have been working on. And the NIFA proposal will contribute to some of the pilot work on the Elliott.
Shannon, what's NIFA?
NIFA, thank you. NIFA is National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And so you can see the types of information that will be gained from these plots. So these would include game cameras, studies on flying insects, ground-dwelling arthropods, soils, and avian point counts. And then layered on top of these are also looking at understory and overstory vegetation, forest carbon measurements, and microbial communities, both in the soil and the canopy. And so we have teams that are working on each of these pieces and then coming together both to talk about how these areas of monitoring can be layered, and then also the locations of this network across the forest in order to support the research program.
Got a question, Jeff? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a question, comment. Just you might talk for a minute about how this comprehensive monitoring plan for the research design relates to a subset, which is the monitoring for the HCP compliance. Just a little bit about that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And you please feel free to add if you have information as well. And so part of this monitoring program, you know, this plan forms, as I said, the backbone of the research program and the monitoring that will happen on the Elliott. A part of this is also contributing to the monitoring that's required under the Habitat Conservation Plan. And so a part of this is looking closely at the requirements of the HCP, as well as the areas of research that were identified in the research proposal. And then there are additional effectiveness monitoring requirements, part of the HCP, that are also folded into the financial analysis for the forest and the work that the research and operations personnel will be completing. Thank you for that reminder, Jeff. So looking at a couple of other examples here of what's being incorporated into this monitoring plan From the aquatic and riparian systems, looking at macroinvertebrates, amphibians, fish surveys, including looking at life history strategies, and the 3 independent populations of Oregon coast coho that are present on the forest, as well as using new technology like eDNA, and in the riparian areas, also including the vegetation plots that we have in the upland systems. Other areas here that are being incorporated into the monitoring plan is looking at climate and microclimate monitoring. And this is also part of the startup funds that are, have been put together, the information there. Looking at monitoring needs for marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl. As part of the social science research, looking at forest management and harvest costs, as well as human ecosystem relationships. So this includes recreation and public access and values for the forest, but then also moves beyond that to the indirect values that people have for the forest. It also includes integrating the sensor network and data management system, as we discussed, and planning for that data management, archiving, and accessibility. So all of these areas build into the adaptive management strategy and the framework that supports that strategy. And so this is a snapshot of that framework. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, this is just a graphic from the research proposal, and you don't need to be able to see the words, but just to reiterate that this is a cyclical process and an iterative process. And so as part of this adaptive management framework, we can break this out into a series of steps that are part of that cycle. So first is conducting an in-depth landscape analysis of the Elliott, which is currently underway using Landis and iLand. Identifying and testing the criteria for selection of those early implementation watersheds, which is also happening right now. And finalizing the criterion candidate watersheds with technical groups is that next step that we're working on here in the next few weeks. The next here is based on these data allocating treatments to each stand within the subwatershed. And so this is a next step that is also incorporating that data that's being collected in the 2022 field season, as well as the LiDAR analysis that's happening right now. Down at the bottom here, you see developing a list of criteria or outcomes that would trigger changes in experimental protocols. And this is part of the outreach and engagement strategy for the forest, is to make sure that these discussions for what those criteria are that would trigger changes have full input, not only from the science technical groups, but also from external peer groups and from the public. Another part of that summer engagement is exploring what changes are experimentally and socially acceptable if those triggers are met. F is designing and implementing monitoring protocols that include those triggers. And so this is part of that monitoring plan design that's currently underway. We're building the framework right now for that monitoring program so that, that when those triggers, that list of triggers and criteria goes through the full public engagement process, that they can be folded into the monitoring program. The last 3 points here are really happening as the Elliott State Research Forest is established. So looking at G here, initiating treatments and monitoring within the first 16 subwatersheds, monitoring criteria that trigger changes in experimental protocols according to the monitoring plan. And then if any criteria or thresholds are reached, to go back and revisit the changes that are experimentally and socially acceptable. And then finally here, adapting treatments for remaining watersheds based on the monitoring results analysis and stakeholder input and the lessons learned from those early implementation subwatersheds.
Thanks, Shannon. Before you go on, Colin, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just was wondering if you could describe a little bit about what the public outreach and engagement process will involve.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So a part of this, we're working on arranging around the June Elliott tour that the advisory committee is going to be engaged in. And so what's been laid out in the engagement process is a series of hybrid meetings that would take place at multiple times this summer, that people would be able to join virtually as well as in local communities in person, as well as working with partners through the technical groups, through partnerships that we've established with local watershed councils and tribes, and making sure that those consultations are also folded into the process.
Thanks, Jen. And Keith?
I'd be remiss and kick myself if I didn't mention this. Shannon, I'm going to have you go back a couple slides to where you listed the 3 postdoc researchers, and to prove that you guys think you will escape Reedsport at some point, and that's absolutely untrue. First of all, you're stuck with Vicki and I, and then Caitlin Riley, who's a Reedsport student, a former student of mine. So one of those 3 postdoc guys, another slide back, I think right there.
Yep.
Andrew Marshall is a former student of mine as well, grew up in Reedsport, grew up 3 houses from me. So you are all honorary Reedsport citizens and will be forever. So.
Thanks, Keith. Shannon, you can go on, and then sort of 5 minutes-ish. I know you've got more to cover, and then it's important stuff, but just sort of in that zone-ish.
Okay, thank you. So then looking at a couple of areas, and I can cover these at a higher level and can talk with you if you have more questions, just based on time. One is looking at aquatic and riparian systems. A part of this is the riparian restoration experiment that we've mentioned, with the objective of restoring key ecological processes with a particular focus on qualities such as wood delivery and shade. This restoration will occur throughout the riparian conservation areas as opposed to only in the outer portion of this area. And it will be along both fish and non-fish bearing streams. So we have a team right now working on this restoration thinning experiment and strategy. Another piece here is looking at integrating across aquatic, riparian, and upland systems in the monitoring plan. And so this is just a snapshot of some of the aquatic and riparian metrics and measurements that are going into the monitoring protocols. And some of these will be part of field visits this summer, pilot studies this year and in the coming years, as well as part of some of the summer work potentially for that crew of field techs that's coming together. And so here is just an example looking at riparian vegetation, the types of tools we have to assess measurements in this area, in particular, the new LiDAR imagery, and then thinking about other areas of monitoring, including water temperature, identifying year-round patterns, and using a network perspective. And so all of these pieces are being folded into that monitoring plan. I'll just, for this slide, mention the extensive silviculture work that's happening, looking at the range of management activities, decision-making points, and monitoring protocols. And a piece of this is identifying what is in the silvicultural toolbox for these extensive areas as opposed to other parts of the triad treatment. And so a couple of examples here, and this is from information that Matt Powers presented to the FMP working group in March. So this is one of his slides, looking at choice of cutting methods, residual density, rotation lengths, gap and opening sizes, and legacy retention. So this is another area where there's a technical team that's going through the different pieces that would be part of ecological forest management treatments. Looking at the financial analysis. So as I mentioned, there is a technical group that's been meeting, consisting of advisory committee members, OSU and DSL. We have been going through a step-by-step discussion and feedback on the categories and values that are in the current draft annual budget, as well as projected Elliott State Research Forest expenses in the first 20 years, the harvest and silvicultural costs that were used in the 2019 and 2020 modeling, projected revenues from the models that were used with MBG, and then harvest modeling growth and yield projections and model assumptions. And so coming out of these conversations, we have gone through all of those spreadsheets and documents together. We've had MBG come and walk us through the modeling that was done, the assumptions, and we've also gotten input from the group on where they feel more work is needed, looking at the range of costs that might be associated with the harvest and silvicultural pieces, as well as the big piece of looking at the growth and yield projections under the experimental design. And so we've just recently gotten a summary document back from MBG, and our team at OSU is working through it right now to make sure that it does address all of those questions, and we'll be sharing that with the FMP working group this week, or sorry, the technical group this week. Another piece on this is coordinating with DSL on information for startup funds and the process for the financial assessment, which we'll also talk about today. Okay, so a couple more slides here looking at education, recreation, and public access. And so the FMP, as I mentioned, will have two sections related to public access for recreation and education. Both of these areas will require standalone management plans, and the FMP will provide the detailed framework and process for developing these plans. But the consensus amongst the teams that have come together, as well as feedback from this advisory committee, is that it's really important to have the Elliott Board of Directors for the authority be part of those discussions about what public access and recreation look like on the forest. And so the pieces that are being developed for the forest management plan are that high level view. In the case of recreation, looking at what is currently happening on the forest now, as well as the process that would happen to create the standalone recreation plan. And in the case of education, looking at the range of formal and informal educational opportunities that would be part of that education program, plan, understanding that the details of that are happening in a separate but connected plan. And just last slide here, looking at the support for the Elliott FMP that we have right now. One is our FMP technical writer, Jeff Behan, who's with the Institute for Natural Resources. He's a research analyst who's been with INR since 2002 and has a professional focus on science analysis and application. We also have the RFP that went out and was closed for the Coast Range Forest Management Expertise contractor. And we've received a strong pool of candidates, and the interviews and selection are currently in progress with a committee. As we mentioned, there's the work going on the 2022 field season, all the work happening across the science technical groups that's building through the next couple of months, as well as the development of forest management plan tools led by different operational teams, including landscape analysis, the forest inventory, the landslide inventory, and development of the data management systems. So that was a whirlwind.
You earned a glass of water. That was a lot. That is.
Apologize for moving quickly through the end to keep us on track for time. But if any of you have questions now or after the meeting, I'm happy to talk more, as well as get your input on these steps.
That was great. Thank you. Comments, questions?
Yeah. It goes back to advisory versus board. The college is making a lot of decisions. The forest management plan is something that the board of this new entity is going to have to live with. And I worry that that they're not involved in the creation of it. So that's a real fear that you're creating something that another group of people are going to have to live with and somehow manage. My question beyond that is, this is really, really complicated. I think I've heard 3 or 4 times a day that this has never been done before. A forest management plan on an experimental forest, and And I guess point blank, my question is, do you feel the college is capable of this? And that would go to the expertise that you're going to bring on. It just seems like there's a lot of help that's needed. The only thing that I can compare this to is the Northwest Forest Plan. And the Northwest Forest Plan was created by 4 PhDs. And I'm here to tell you today that it didn't work. So that is my fear. Some people may think it worked, but from our point of view in industry and manufacturing and the communities in Southwest Oregon, it's a monumental failure. And I worry that the expertise that we're employing to create this forest management plan, we're going to have another Northwest Forest Plan event. So do you think OSU is capable?
I think there are a couple of pieces there that are really important and also kind of speak to the approach that we're taking with this FMP. One is that there is an incredible number of people working on this from a broad range of disciplines and perspectives, not just researchers, but also bringing in practitioners and local communities. And so if it was a small team of just a couple people, I'm not sure how to answer whether they could pull it off or not, but I think our approach has been to try to bring together the full group of people who can bring together the experience and look at some of the work that's been done in other experimental forests in plans like the Northwest Forest Plan, to learn from those experiences, to bring what works and look at what might need to be tweaked for the Elliott. But another key piece of this is also looking at the adaptive management strategy, just for the long term, research and management program on the Elliott. And so not trying to rush into management of this forest as if we know what works best, but using the adaptive management strategy and the focus on the early implementation sub-watersheds and all the expertise that we're bringing together to write this plan to set us up on that trajectory as best we can. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's how we're seeing the approach and how to bring together all of these moving parts on what we all know is a very quick timeline.
Just to give some feedback to that, my experience, I'm on the FMP committee, I'm on the financial committee, and there's a lot of stuff being done that's being reported to us. I don't know that the input that we're giving is being incorporated into that. It doesn't seem to be. So it's frustrating in that regard, especially with the financials. It's like we've got a number that we're trying to prove, and we're trying to prove that number with different inputs, more correct inputs, and trying to get to that same number. And it in my mind, it doesn't work. It's a different number that we're going to come up with. So the other piece of advice, and I don't know, maybe you looked at this, and I really wish that the committee in some form had been involved in the contracting, selecting the contractor, because we know people that can get stuff done, and we know people that don't get stuff done. And I would have liked to have had some input on that. The only thing I can think of that compares to this sort of thing is something that the Grand Ronds have done, and the Coquilles have done, and the Klutzies have done, and that's the forest plans that they're developing from scratch. And hopefully you reached out and you got input from those folks, the Cow Creeks. All of a sudden they had land that they needed to develop a plan for. So anyway, I'll stop ranting, but I worry about the expertise and how the input's being used.
Thanks for the input, Paul.
I think I share a little bit some of Paul's concerns over there. It seems, well, just a comment, I think, which it feels like there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And sometimes there can be too many cooks in the kitchen. So at some level, it feels like someone's got to actually be sitting down and producing the drafts themselves that they can push out to folks. And it wasn't clear to me who's doing that exactly. So I think that's just a comment, and maybe it's that Jeff Behan who's going to start pulling those together. The second thing is more of a question. I saw this September 2022 date to discuss the chapters with this committee, and I guess I'm wondering, is that when we're going to see them for the first time? Will we see anything before then? And then furthermore, will there be room, or how much room is there after we see them to say something about them? Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So September 1st is on the 2022 work plan to help get us to the December land board meeting. As we have information that's come together in a complete draft section, we could be able to share those ahead of time. And I think one of the areas that we're hoping to engage the FMP working group members and other members of the advisory committee more in the next couple of months is through those technical groups as the outlines are developed. And so the goal for us and the timeline we're working with is to share the draft sections for full discussion at the September advisory committee meeting with enough time for the advisory committee to fully digest and be able to make comments and input and be prepared for that meeting, but understanding that any information that we share in pieces along the way will help us get there in those draft forms. And then so if that addresses your question.
I think it does. I guess for me, ideally, I'd be able to say, here's the Riparian chapter, and then here's some key dates when there'll be drafts due, like, June 1st, whoever's doing it is going to have the first draft done. And then, July 30 or whatever it is, sort of leading up. I mean, my concern is that I might get something dropped on my plate on September 1st that I've got serious concerns about, or I think need changes, and there's not time or room, or it's more of a problem than it needs to be. So just earlier better is better, I think there.
I think that was the message there. I think earlier is better, and with the intention of earlier is time to incorporate feedback prior to even the initial drafts coming to the full committee, right? To appreciate the feedback, Bob.
Well, I want to comment on that because I agree with that. As these pieces start coming together, they need to be flowing out. We shouldn't be waiting until we get the entire FMP.
And I think I heard from Shannon that the intent is to have.
Yes, and that is that's not the goal, is to just develop everything and then send it out for review. It's to share pieces as they are developed.
Okay, because we're never going to get it ready for land board in December if we don't do that. Okay.
So Colin, and then Bogdan, will have you join us.
Thanks. So I just wanted to say I agree with the sentiment that earlier is better. And I think it would be really helpful if we could see a draft that was a little bit more, or outline that was a little bit more fleshed out. I think the last draft we saw was maybe towards the end of last year. And it would be help to, and I think a lot of us provided some input on that as well, but we haven't seen an updated version of that. So it'd be helpful to get an updated copy of that sent out.
Thanks, Colin. Anything else before we transition to the next agenda topic? And I appreciate that, this is you're building the plane as you're flying it, right? It is, you're creating the content and working to provide as much stability in terms of expectations of when product is going to be developed, but you're also trying to develop the content and product that folks are. So we'll try to strike the balance in terms of providing sort of the process plan without spending too much energy on the process planning side of things and as much energy as possible on the content generation, with the idea that early is in fact better, and time for iterations to flow and feedback to be incorporated is critical. And I think that's the baseline that everybody's striving for, is opportunity for input early and often, with the idea that further refinement, iterations, and incorporation of your feedback and suggestions is going to be critical to getting to a place where folks feel comfortable with the product in December of 2022. So that's the goal. Yeah, Captain Sully is helpful, but yeah, he did land it, but that's not the metaphor we're going for. Captain Sully was great, but we're looking for a smoother landing.
I would just also say too is,
Lean into the microphone, Svar.
you know, Peter and Jenna, you have a hard job corralling this group, but I think in terms of order of magnitude, Shannon, your job is 10 times harder than they have. So I acknowledge and appreciate just the challenge you have of bringing this all together and leading the OSU charge here. And I agree with a lot of the comments were made, but I also just appreciate that what you're working through is big. So thank you for digging in on all that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mark. And thank you to all of you for your continued input and the comments. And I think we are absolutely all on the same page about earlier and more often is better, and making sure that we are communicating effectively with you all and being able to incorporate your input throughout this whole process in the next couple of months leading up to September 1st and the December Land Board meeting.
And I know we're scheduled for a break here relatively soon. If you feel like, I'm going to suggest we continue with the presentation. If you feel like you need to get up, grab a coffee, please do so. Restrooms are out this way, but we'll keep charging forward. You know, Bogdan, I was initially supportive of that, but having heard the feedback through the chat about those that are connected virtually, I might actually have you, or we have a handheld mic you might be able to use.
I can't speak loud enough.
Not for these guys.
I will be sitting. Thank you. I hope that everybody online hear me. Now I have to speak a little bit soft. So what I will be speaking today, and before we start teaching, we know that the attention span for any human being, it's around 15 minutes. After that, the mind start going away. So I will try to deliver my message in the first 15 minutes. And my message is very, very simple. It's about forest inventory and carbon monitoring. And now this is a topic that can go both ways. Either extremely very boring or kind of exciting. And let's see where I'm going to be landing. So to see how everything works, I like to set the stage like in a play. And you don't see, let's see. Okay, you don't see the title, but that title it says forest inventory. It's under the Zoom bar. So any forest inventory starts with a data acquisition. And the data acquisition, we learn in school that is done by walking the ground. That's the golden standard. Even today, data that is actually measured by humans, going there and putting the caliper or the measuring tape, the D-tape on the tree, that's what people believe. But if we are speaking with very large piece of land, then there is a chance that you will be looking to something more sophisticated. Now we live in the year of God 2022, so some things happen in the last 4,000 or 5,000 years. And one of those things is flying. And if you fly, then you will have to use things that are not necessarily connected with the tree. Therefore, we are using various sensors. And depending on the sensor, we can create a description of the reality, either with images, which is basically a 2D object, or a 3D object, which one option is by points. Okay, so the most famous point description of reality is LiDAR, basically sending laser pulses to the ground. Now, these remote sensing details can help us create or describe the forest entirely, or can be merged together with the field data. And by far, the best option to create a forest inventory is a combination of the two, with the caveat that you have to pay both to fly and to cruise. Okay, so irrespective of the way how the inventory is done, there are two approaches of describing the inventory. One is using the stand. Now, a polygon, how much timber is there? Okay, we have kind of, let's say 200 trees per acre. Okay, but that's 200 trees per acre is spread over, let's say 50 acres. You don't know exactly where those 220 trees per acre are. It's somewhere in that now 50 acre stand. Or you know where the trees are, basically. You have a full description of the stand, XY, of every single tree. Now, if you are speaking about stand level information, that usually is filled with the help of remote sensing, or kind of a low level remote sensing data. Now, if you speak tree level, you have to deal with remote sensing because it's so much information to digest that people literally cannot do it operationally. Like we can do it, we can measure 10 million trees, but it's going to take kind of a long time. So we're going to have to use a different tool, different instrument. And if we have the ability to deal with trees, then guess what? Brand new doors open for us. And those are the fact that we can scale all our request questions, all our curiosity in time and space. So this is what we will be doing in Elliott. We will be, how to put it, chasing the golden goose or the egg of the golden goose. I don't know exactly how it's saying in English, but probably you got my drift. Okay, so how the data from the Elliott Forest looks like is based on a 2021 flight. And what you see here is basically an overlay of what we have. And that flight provided us with two types of data. A 2D description of the forest, basically imagery, with the comment that it was very high resolution imagery, 6 inches. For those of you who are not familiar with this size, which is 15 centimeters, roughly, is, if you look at Google Earth, then that's the size that the Google Earth has in the best areas. And best areas usually are not over the forest. Best areas are over the cities, where there is a lot of interest, not only the forestry. No, you have civil engineering, other stuff. So we have phenomenal, literally phenomenal data set that is not only RGB, basically red, green, blue, which is the data that you're going to get over the city, but we have also the near infrared, which is that data that is really, really sensitive to vegetation. So we have a spectacular imagery. But guess what? The story doesn't end here. We have something out of ordinary in terms of LiDAR. This flight acquired images and LiDAR, basically a 3D description of reality. That LiDAR was flown basically with airplanes, and we got, because this is the state mandates, around 7 points per square foot or more. What does that mean for people who are a little bit familiar with LiDAR? Is 70 points per square meter or more. We have tiles that have more than 100 points per square meter. That's unheard of. If you go flying UAVs, which fly extremely, extremely smaller area comparing with this, yes, you can get way more than that. But from aerial, this is the first that I have seen for the size of this project. And I'm going to show you what does that means in information that you can extract out of that LiDAR point cloud. And
The vendor provided us with a color point cloud, which is also a nice feature to have. Not necessarily that is very helpful, but it's really visually pleasing. And I will gonna show you in just a couple of slides what does that means. So the entire Elliott forest is covered by more than 500 tiles. Each tile 1,000 feet by 1,000 feet, just to have an idea of the magnitude of the data that is to be processed. So this is the imagery, and this is a snapshot of the 4-band images, high resolution images that it was acquired. And what I'm doing right now, I'm going to zoom a little bit in just to see what I'm speaking about. So this is an intermediate zoom. Clearly you see the roads, but look what we have right now. Now we see branches. Now we see branches. That's simply spectacular. It's how to put it. The ground is the limit, not the sky is the limit. No, because now we're looking downwards. No. So yes, we have extremely good imagery, and we have, as I said, even better LiDAR. Now, you know what you always like when mistakes happen your way, and this is a case that happened to us. So when the draft was done, we said, okay, how much is the point density from the vendor? 20 points per square meter. Now, a mistake was made, and we got more than 70. So that means that we are really on the good side. The starting point of the inventory for Elliott, it's extremely very good, to put it at the least. So this is an nadir view, basically a top view of the forest. It looks like an image, but it's not. It is a 3D object. Now, when you look from the side, you see few things here that I really want to point it out to you. Now, kind of Elliott is a kind of a steep ground. Now you see this? But what is really cool is that we can see from above the stems. That's really rare for forests that have a heavy canopy. Really rare. Now let's see if this one works. Yes, it does work. Because it's a 3D object, it's very hard to see that it's 3D. So I just made a little bit of a movie for you to see that we are speaking as on a brand new game in terms of what we have to work with. So now that we see the data that is in, let's see what we can do with that data. And as I said, this project will work with inventories that is individual tree, meaning we will like to know kind of everything about every single tree that is in Elliott. So a couple of years ago, I read a paper saying that Switzerland is one of the few countries that they know exactly where every single tree is. Now, I was just thinking, yeah, that's really cool, considering that Switzerland is the size of the Lane County, and it has a population the size of 2 Oregons or more. I don't know, probably around 10 million people are in Switzerland. So if you have been to Switzerland, that's one of the places that me as a forester really scared the heck out of me. Even the grass in the forest grows in lines. So it's really cool in the sense that, yes, you can do a lot if you have that density. But here we don't have that. So we have to supplement all that lack of people with a heaps amount of brain. So again, here we have our trees, and we see very well the canopy, and we see the stem. And we're going to use LiDAR to identify every single tree. Now, we're going to do that with algorithms. And I'm not going to bore you to death with algorithms, because I know that immediately everybody will going to find that you have very busy in another place. So I'm going to skip on the details. I was just going to tell you that we're going to have a ground verification schemes of all those trees. So we're going to know exactly where the trees are, hopefully, and then we're going to go in the field and see whether or not the trees are there. Now, what we will expect to get out of those point clouds? is something very simple. To know exactly how many trees are there. And we are speaking way more than 10 million trees for the Elliott. And for every single tree, we would like to know how tall they are, where the crowns start, and basically the X and Y of every single tree. Now that's kind of makes sense if you want to do the ground check. But as you see, LiDAR will gonna give us dimension. We're not gonna tell us the story about what is there in terms of species. But that part of the puzzle will be supplied by that really, really high quality, high resolution imagery that is multispectral, have the 4 bands. And again, we're gonna find the species by doing a ground verification. So now we have a lot of information about the trees. So how we are dealing with the carbon. Now carbon is coming as the new gold standard for various perspectives. So carbon is stored above ground and below ground. Irrespective of how you will be looking at it, you will have to use either the inventory for some portion or to model for where the carbon is actually located. And we will be using various models, but the main thing is that the vast majority of models uses species specific. So what you see here is basically how much carbon is stored. This is from a paper from 2020 in terms of the size of the tree. Now, this allocation of the carbon in respect to the size of the tree, and remember, we have the inventory, therefore we're gonna know the species and the size of the trees, therefore we can infer how much carbon is usually done at the stand level. So we have some plots, measure some trees, diameter and height, and then expand that information for the entire area. But basically our area-based estimates. But what we are proposing is again to go back to the individual tree. We will have that information. And that will provide a fine but very fundamental distinction than the previous approaches. And that distinction is that we will not gonna use, how to put it, a big hammer and say, okay, every single piece of the stem or of the tree has the same amount of carbon. No, carbon is differently allocated along the stem. And because we have that high density of points, we know where the crown is, how much within the crown is in terms of sizes. Therefore, we can tailor the amount of carbon along the stem. So we're going to have way more accurate representation of the carbon that is stored in Elliott. And in this process, we'll also gain the precision. So what you see here, this is a paper from 2019. And if you focus only on this part, just by using the LiDAR, they increase the precision with at least 20%. Okay. So as a teacher, I'm familiar with stopping me and asking questions while I'm speaking. So don't think that if you're going to stop me, I'm going to get, oh, I lost my train of thoughts. Okay, so for the monitoring, I think that that's this S4 is monitoring there. So how we're going to monitor now that we have this extremely rich data and that we have to build on it is basically we're going to have to do something similar in the future. Now, the repeatability of having such an extensive flight is not necessarily every year, but it can happen every 5 years, every 10 years. That's depending on many parameters, many questions. But what we can do, we can annually survey different portion of the stand, of the forest. And to do that, we're going to use tools that we have at hand, such as this toy that we're just going to acquire, which is a UAV that has LiDAR and cameras on it. And we're going to scan, as I said, portion of the forest, the one that are considered very important, such as riparian areas, some more mature forests, or some of the stands that are subject to active management in that particular year or in the next year. Now, you will be wondering, okay, that's a lot of stuff. Now, the answer is not, it's not a lot of stuff. Some cookies are coming along, and those cookies are under the canopy. So we will be augment all that information from above, bird's eye view, with something underneath, because there are a lot of cookies sitting under the canopy. And we're going to use those, we're going to try to find those cookies using terrestrial LiDAR. And what we see here, this is one of my students scanning with a handheld unit. And just to have a peek of the richness of the information that we have, we gain by scanning under the canopy is, okay, I just have another row before we're going to go to the movie. And what I want to tell you here is that the inclusion of terrestrial LiDAR will really open a brand new era of forest management, in the sense that we will have at our disposal a comprehensive description of the entire forest. We will not going to chase only wood or carbon. No, at that point, we'll be looking to habitat, to coarse woody debris, to every single bit of information that was missing or it was very expensive to do an inventory. So this is just a short movie that we get from, I just built it from one of the scans that we have from HG Andrews. I didn't do the scan in Elliott, but just to show you that every single bit of this tree is a point, is not an image. And what we learn, anyway, what I learned from this exercise myself is that Elliott will gonna have a state-of-the-art forest inventory, like something that is very rare executed anywhere in the world in some very, very special circumstances. And the main difference between what Elliott is doing with any other forest management, except which is, as I said, in areas that have a very high density of people that can afford a significant human impact, is that we will be doing an individual tree inventory. Now, that we're going to trigger immediately into the fact that we're going to have a very accurate and precise carbon monitoring. And this project will bring at the same table, on a continuous scale, time-wise, the UAS and the terrestrial LiDAR with the large areas data that is available for Elliott. And that pretty much is my pitch. I don't know if I scare you or not. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Bogdan. Paul.
I've been fortunate to see some really good concerts in my life, and I came away from every good one thinking, God, they're way much better live. And that's what I kept thinking here today is you're way much better live. So I would love to take one of your classes. You're a teacher. And just a kind of a trivia question. What about the rhododendrons and the salal? There's carbon there. Can you measure that?
Either a pie in the sky, probably is, but so how to put it? You cannot measure something that you cannot see.
Okay.
So in order to see it, we have to have enough points, enough reality that we're gonna capture that small entity. And I assume that yes, it's possible, but I don't see it happening very soon. And I can tell you for sure that this is not on my alley. Like my alley, there are way more cookies ahead of me, which are really important for forest industry, more stringent than. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to offend people. Then salal, not that salal is not important, but I'm just saying that salal and other smaller species are probably clumped together into the dominated species, let's put it in this way. And I would like to give you we're gonna do it. Next year, we're gonna have something on your table, but that's not gonna happen on my shop anyway.
My point being that in a big fire, that gets consumed, the dirt gets consumed, and there's carbon there. And do we have a way of measuring that?
I would say that it will be better than before. And the main reason is because we have 3-level information, meaning sizes and location, we will have better models for salal. Again, we will not gonna measure salal and other species on the same size class, but we will have better model for that, if that makes sense. So, and that one, I think that is really achievable, not on long term, like not, okay, let's meet another 200 years from now and rediscuss this topic.
Thank you. Okay, Michael, and then we'll take a quick break and wrap up. Go ahead.
I just want to wrap my mind around this because I come from Tillamook and all the cows in the dairy all have their own little tags, and my friends that are farmers, they know each one of those very intimately. I don't know how, because there's hundreds. Is that the level of detail that you could electronically tag every single tree in every plot? Is that what we're looking at?
Now, as much as I would like to say no, I have to say yes. So yes, that will be the scary part, that we will know every single bit that is in our woods.
Well, that's truly amazing. And then it gets to what Paul was saying. With that level of detail, you could go on site and kind of get a look around and see and confirm what the undergrowth is and the soil. So I'm just thinking for research, it's pretty amazing. And I'm really happy to be geeking out on it right now.
I will break it for you to say, give me just 1 second, is that as nice as research is, and don't get me wrong, I'm in the ivory tower, okay? I will really like to see my work being used. So what we are doing at Oregon State is that we take all this rich information and come out with plans that, okay, what is the best strategy now that you have this to thin or to do a particular silvicultural treatment that people in the field can go and use it.
Thanks, Bogdan. Tom, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I would just really briefly, because Paul said that a couple of things that, first of all, that the dirt gets burned up and although under a really high severity fire that you can have, you lose the over-horizon during fires, you rarely lose much carbon from the mineral soil. And interestingly enough, there's more carbon in the mineral soil below ground than there is in the canopy, but everybody, of course, we all focus on the canopy. That soil carbon was accumulated over, 10,000 years or more. And so it's a slow process that accumulates the carbon in the soil. And it's tough to drive that carbon out of the mineral soil unless you're leaving that system bare, like tilling it like in agriculture, or leaving the system bare for extended periods of time. So the point is that there's a lot of carbon in the soil, and that carbon is going to be inventoried, but with more of a brute force method than what Bogdan's talking about, that they're able to do now with the LiDAR and the terrestrial LiDAR, which is truly amazing. Not to say there's not going to be that kind of development down the road for the soils and the understory. It will come eventually. But in the meantime, we'll be linking understory plots for the shrubs and moss community, the herbs and grasses, and we'll have biomass plots that from which carbon will be estimated, and we'll have soil pits and plots that will estimate the soil carbon. So we'll be doing whole system carbon inventory. But when you're talking about the rapid turnover, like the growth and death of trees when they, when they fall in the forest, or if you harvest, or if there's an insect outbreak and trees, there's high tree mortality, that's rapid turnover of carbon, relatively speaking, compared to that soil carbon, which is slow twitch. And anyhow, point is that will be inventoried. It'll just be more of a brute force method, but it will be directly tied to the type of data that Bogdan's analyzing for.
Thanks, Tom.
Just for the record, I wanted to say, besides being the dean of the College of Forestry, he clearly has an acute interest in forest soils.
Thank you, Mark.
I'm just having visions of Paul and I debating every single individual tree in the forest now.
I think we all had that nightmare.
One by one till 10 million.
I've got some that I'm going to call Bob.
Whether they'll be there next year is yet to be seen. Let's take a 5-minute break. And Bogdan, thank you very much. I think what it's helpful in doing is reminding us what makes you excited and what we're all excited about on the research side, and the opportunity here and the enthusiasm that generates for many of us, but certainly for the faculty and many scientists around the world. So thanks.
I was going to suggest if we run into naysayers in the future, we just send Bogdan to their house. In about 10 seconds, they're going to be writing research checks to Oregon State University. Right?
Great. So let's take 5 minutes and then we'll come back. We've got a little bit of sort of updates we'll do as efficiently as possible. Still committed to getting you done by 3:40. Members of the public, at this point, we don't have anybody who's expressed an interest to do public comment. Now's the chance to chime in via a chat to Jenna if you're interested in providing comment. Thanks. Let's take 5. We're going to go ahead and get started. Very valuable. I spent time in the laboratory this morning on timeline.
Between now and December. And so this is not all the work, but it's key pieces of it. You were close, Ted. I saw it go by once. Even so, while Ted's working on the slide, I just want to start out with the FMP to follow up on, and Shannon and I coordinated on this. The most important piece, well, there are a lot of important pieces, but a key piece of this is the forest management plan. OSU is in the driver's seat on that. They're working with you all and with the help of Oregon Consensus. And DSL is providing some funding to resource the effort, but it really is those two significant milestones that you all just talked about. That's September 1st and December 1st. The rough draft of key sections by December, completion of those by September, completion by December of those key sections. What we want to do is something that's akin to what happened in December 2020 at the land board meeting, where the OSU proposal was in fine shape. The advisory committee understood what was in it, what wasn't quite done, was able to talk about it and come and sit in front of the land board and give your perspective that it was ready, contingent upon completion of certain things. And so that's our goal for the FMP in this year. The HCP has been declared NEPA ready, which means both federal agencies said there's no significant flaw or showstopper in the administrative draft that's before them. And they are working on their comments and review of it, and are going to start up the NEPA process, which is a federally run public process. I'm going to come back to that because I want to introduce Shauna to you from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She's a guest here, but I want to first just run through a couple of the other pieces of this work plan, and then we can hear from Shauna for 2 minutes about what the schedule is from Fish and Wildlife Service's perspective for public input on both the HCP and the environmental impact statement that's being prepared. There's a financial plan that should say draft. OSU completes draft financial plan. My apologies. I sent the wrong version after we talked last night. So OSU is going to have a substantially complete financial plan. There are probably some components that will be developed in months subsequent to May, but we'll know the forest financial plan by May. Pursuant to the statute, we're getting ready to have an independent review of that we'll have back before the end of the summer. We can do some reconciliation and we can talk to you about it. We'll have a public outreach so the public understands what that financial plan says. And we are on target to present that to the land board at the December meeting. Paul, anything that I forgot to add on that you want to provide? And then if there's questions from the group, I want to make sure we pause on this one.
Paul and Bill. Thanks. Yeah, right. Yeah. You want to add something? Yeah.
Always.
Always, yeah. So not a whole lot to add. I mean, we continue to refine the financial plan as the FMP gets developed, and as we do more work to understand how the authority will function and what the costs are as well. And there's more work on that to do. We look forward to having the independent review and working with DSL and discussions of selection of who that will be, and working with them. And we see that as a bit of an iterative process to help us refine that across the summer and have a good product.
Yeah, and I think that's a key. We look at it as an iterative too. We want this independent review to be done, and then we can sit down, and if there's something to be reconciled, then we talk that through, and we talk it through with the interested advisory committee members and OSU and DSL. We want to get us to a point that Vicki can sit in front of the land board and say, and this committee can say, we understand what the ongoing financial plan is for the forest, and we've got enough margin for error that we're all comfortable it'll be financially self-sustaining. So on the appraisal, we touched on that earlier in the meeting. I don't know if folks have any questions about the appraisal specifically that you want to talk more about. It's suffice it to say, when we get work product back, we will be sharing it with the advisory committee first and with the public also. And we have structured the appraisal so that we're not just appraising the forest as it will be operated under the proposed HCP, but also an alternative that is that just to address questions that have been raised about whether the HCP that we're going to be pursuing will drive value in a way that would change the equation or the understanding of folks about the current valuation of the forest. So there's a lot to be done around findings for what's necessary for the board to actually take a vote to decouple the forest from the Common School Fund. So Department of Justice is going to be working on that over the summer, and you can expect that we'll have a very robust conversation about both things and the financial analysis at the September meeting of this committee.
Hold on one sec.
Yeah,
Colin?
Yeah, I had a question related to the appraisal. I had brought up some concerns related to the 2016 appraisal and specifically the sideboards that were on that appraisal. And I was just curious if DSL has already contracted for the new appraisal, and if the advisory committee will get a chance to review the guidelines that have gone to the contractor.
We have contracted with Mason Bruce Gerard and had substantial discussions with legal counsel on the framing of the instructions to the appraisal. And the rest of it is set by the standards for appraisals generally of forest lands. So the contract is underway, and that will be part of what's shared at the time. Is what were the baseline assumptions behind this appraised value? What were the standards or the principles applied by the appraiser, and what was the valuation that came out?
Okay, and will those instructions be shared when the appraisal was made available, or prior to it? Okay.
Yes.
And I would say, Colin, one of the reasons we had a delay in getting that appraisal off and running is because DOJ takes a long time to review it. And there was a lot of back and forth, which is another reason I want to point out that we need to get started sooner rather than later, so DOJ can define the parameters of the forest and as per the legislation, so we can be ready in December. The DOJ staff are great, but they're super busy and they take a long time. So we just need to make sure we give them the time it takes.
We are also integrating so that we have a valuation on East Hackey Ridge as well, which we didn't have in the 2016 appraisal. So that's required a fair amount of gathering of databases and the ability to model some things, so on stands.
And is everyone here familiar with East Hackey Ridge and why it's important? Okay.
Are we going to talk about East Hackey Ridge?
We're all familiar.
Okay.
And if you're not, we'll add it to a future agenda.
We're not ready yet. Just want to make sure y'all know what we're talking about.
And as I said to the land board earlier, currently we have an appraised value of $221 million for the forest. If that changes, we'll be having some conversation about the implications. And that's about as much as I really can say at this point. Shutter Creek, there's a lot of interest in seeing if Shutter Creek's a viable option for the headquarters for the research facilities and administration of the forest. And we're working a lot with the congressional delegation. I took 2 calls in the middle of this meeting, in fact, answering questions from congressional staff and committee staff around how to secure some federal funding that might help that happen. I don't know if that'll happen or not, but we are about to put in a request for transfer of the property to the GSA, which is the Government Services Administration that manages all federal lands. And that will go in with contingencies that will give us until probably November-ish before we have to make a decision about whether we really want to take the property or not. And we'll know a lot more about some of the environmental considerations and the operation and maintenance costs and deferred maintenance issues that are associated with buildings that were built by the Air Force in the 1950s. That's really our focus right now. And we want to understand clearly the budget implications for capital construction of what needs to be done, but also for making sure that the site doesn't have huge operational costs going forward that are holdovers from the prior. And there are a lot of structures that are past end of life there. So I got a real feedback, I think, from this morning. The governor is very interested in having us make sure that we run this one to the ground and understand it, but to see what great potential it has to actually have this piece of the equation be part of the Elliott State Research Forest Authority. So startup costs. Right now, I think we have a total of $13.8 million in appropriations requests between OSU and DSL and the governor's office, in with Senator Merkley's office. Senator Wyden's office is helping out, and we're working also with Representative Fazio's office. That's related to the startup costs, which are one-time costs to stand the forest up until the harvest begin, and to instrument it and do some of the baseline monitoring and a number of other things that happen in the first 3 years after the authority is created. I think also there's potential of a couple of federal grant opportunities. Katie Kavanaugh, I know, is working on a carbon smart idea that is a federal grant solicitation from the USDA that might have applications for the forest. We're looking with Fish and Wildlife Service at Land Water Conservation funds coming through the pipeline through Oregon Parks and through Oregon Fish and Wildlife Department from the federal government. So those are yet to be explored, but we're working hard on startup costs as well. And then the carbon project, we are in detailed analysis of how you knit together a carbon project with an HCP and what are the implications of the HCP we've got for the potential to have a registered carbon project that would let us monetize and receive some funds for stored carbon on the Elliott without interfering with the research, design, and management platform of the Elliott. And by the time you put in the research management platform, the HCP requirements and the regulatory pieces of that, sorting through what the carbon opportunity is not something that we've been able to find anybody else has done yet, particularly on public lands. So to the best of our understanding, this is new territory, but we're really looking at it closely, and it still has potential and may have implications for how we cover startup costs or other things that are associated with supporting research on into the future. The good news is we're not looking at carbon as part of decoupling the forest anymore. We're not looking at carbon as something that is necessary for building facilities. It really is added value toward the opportunity for the research program in the future. We'll be working with OSU on that early in the summer and reaching a decision point on what's possible and whether I guess the best way to put it is whether the juice is worth the squeeze of the effort that'll have to go into a registration in the regulated market. We'll figure it out. So we'll be coming back to you with more about that. I want to introduce Shauna Everett from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Shauna is on point for the HCP and NEPA process, and she wants to be here to give you a quick thumbnail of what the public involvement is going to look like that's being run by Fish and Wildlife Service, because all of your constituencies are going to be interested in it and confused by the fact that we had all of this public involvement run by the state, and now they're doing it again, but this time it's a federal process. So we need the mic for Shauna in 2 minutes or so, and any questions you have on this piece is great, and then anything I just covered, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for the invite, and congratulations, and thank you guys for this important work. This is amazing to sort of step into new and see. I'm really excited about it. So we are essentially in our NEPA scoping, internal scoping right now with this. So just to back up, the incidental take permit, the permitting decision we're going to be making for the HCP is a federal action. And so we're required to do NEPA and look at the environmental, social, and economic effects of that proposed action. So right now we've been reaching out to potential cooperating agencies and tribes. We're going to start our public scoping period for this. Hopefully we'll publish that notice of intent at the end of this month. And you'll expect a virtual public meeting to happen maybe about mid-May. It'll be a 30-day open period for public comment. And what we're looking for there is really input on general issues as we're developing the environmental impact statement and as the HCP is being prepared. So focusing on the resources we're going to evaluate, socioeconomics, water, recreation, those things you look at in NEPA. Suggestions for alternatives. So really when we do look at HCPs, there's the preferred action, which is what the applicant proposes, the HCP. And then there's a no action, and really the no action or actions is doing administering the permit. So the no action is kind of not doing the permit. What does that look like? And then the alternatives can be variations. Often you see a shorter permit term, for example. What does that analysis look like compared to what the preferred alternative is? So that's the type of input we're going to be looking for, just general information, studies we may need to consider, new information as we're assessing that action. And then after that, and we are doing this through contract work too. So we have an entire team helping us write the EIS. NIMS is, of course, a cooperating agency in this, and we're working closely with them through the NEPA process as well. And the permits decisions and the permit applications are separate for the service and NIMS, but really the NEPA process is something we're leading and doing together. And then as Jeff said, that moves in, that's happening hopefully in the next month or two. And then by fall, early winter, we should be putting out for public comment a draft EIS, and a draft HCP will be available at that time. We'll have another virtual public meeting. It'll probably be at least a 45-day public comment period that's required in the regs. And we're going to be looking for input on the documents, the analysis, the alternatives. Did we miss anything? Is there anything new? And then hopefully, we churn that in the sort of sausage factory and come out with a final EIS and final, I'll put in air quotes, HCP by the July deadline, but we're hoping for spring 2023. And then there's some more steps after that. We have to complete our decision documents, record of decision, which concludes our NEPA, our findings, which records our ESA decision on the permit itself, issuing the permit if we decide to do that. And in the meanwhile, just for awareness, throughout this whole process, we have the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 compliance we're doing, any government to government consultation with tribes we'll be doing, if that's requested. We also have to consult with ourselves on Endangered Species Act Section 7. So we have to do that and issue a biological opinion because it's an action that can affect species. So that's fun. So there's a lot going on in the background. Both services will be doing in terms of ESA and our NEPA responsibilities.
And we have ongoing project team meetings every other week, and Shauna and I touch base on the off weeks. And I can tell you that there's a lot of collaboration happening to move this through, and everyone is aware of that July 1st, 2023 deadline. The directors of both state offices were part of signing off on, hey, that's a reasonable deadline. We have a process that we think has a good shot at making it through. So any questions you have for Shauna or for me?
Yeah, maybe one for each of you. Sean, has the purpose and need statement been written? Is that available to look at, or is that?
Yes, it will be in the notice of intent that will come out at the end of this month.
Okay.
And really it has to do with issuing the permit.
And is that available to look at yet, or, I mean?
Not till the notice of intent comes out.
Okay.
I think.
And then maybe for you, or maybe for you, Jeff, in terms of the HCP, can you describe a little, what part of the Western Reserve is or isn't considered part of the HCP application and activity?
Western Reserve.
So, the 34,000 acres that's on the west half of the Elliott.
CRW.
Oh, the CRW? You renamed it, oh. The Salinger Memorial something. It is within the scope of the permit. All of it. And then the Elliott is within the scope of the permit, and some of the in holdings are also within the permit. There's a difference, Shauna, between
Permit area and plan area.
Yes, exactly. The permit area and the plan area. And Sean is going to describe the difference for you.
Permit area is what we're permitting. The plan area, though, is being assessed in case those lands become part of the permit area in the future. The analysis will have sort of streamlined that, and it can affect the permit area. So that's being included.
And I'm always confused between the two, but I can tell you that the portions of the Elliott that are not common school fund lands, like that bullseye and the eyebrow that Vicky talks about, or East Hackey Ridge, those are within the plan area, but not in the permitted piece at this point. That way, if there's ever a change in the ownership structure, they can, we don't have to go through an amendment of the HCP itself in order to fold them in in quite the same level of process and detail, I'm told, as if we did not include them in the plan area.
So just to clarify my own thinking on it, in the incidental take statement, is the, say, murrelet habitat in the conservation reserve considered mitigation, for lack of a better word, for activities within the permitted area?
Why don't we set up a meeting with ICF to talk that through? Because there's a difference between what's covered by the permit and what is considered mitigation as a result of impacts to the protected species. And we've been very careful about not putting more in the mitigation bucket than we need to in order to preserve more options for our other venues where we want to play, like in a potential carbon market or something. And frankly, when we were doing the effects analysis, there wasn't a need for a lot of mitigation because of all the conservation actions that are built into the covered activities of the operation, the management platform of the forest. So mitigation there was not extensive mitigation in that, and things put in the mitigation bucket because of the conservation orientation of the management plan and the research purpose. But I'm happy to have any of you that would like to engage in a very lengthy, detailed discussion about that on a Zoom call, especially given the looks I'm getting.
I would suggest
not you.
Yes, let's set up a separate conversation rather than taking more time on this. Paul, do you got something you got to get on?
Well, let's talk about Tacky Ridge a little bit. It goes to the HCP. Now, Tacky Ridge was sold and now it's unsold, correct? I assumed that when they did the HCP, it was assumed that that was a clear cut. It was sold to somebody that intended to harvest it.
But they didn't harvest it.
But I think that the nuance is the reason. I'm not trying to sidestep the significance of it, Paul, by saying let's not talk about it. In fact, I think that it's an significant enough topic that it warrants some dedicated conversation, which we really don't have time for today. So I think let's tee it up in a way that we can have meaningful information to respond to these types of questions. And I do want to flag just briefly, we got a question about whether it is or isn't included in the current appraisal or will or won't be in the future appraisal. So if we can address that, and then is that all right, Paul?
No, I actually just want to get that out there. It came out in the last meeting that it, proposed reserve area. And I'm under the impression that it was assumed to be harvested, i.e. clear cut.
And I think there are two things that I'd like to say. One is that the HCP doesn't have any prescriptions associated with East Tacky Ridge today. It's part of the plan area coverage, but it's not, we've not set out prescriptions or dealt with the management structure for East Tacky Ridge in the administrative draft that's been submitted to the agencies. Second is, I forgot my second.
Appraised or not?
It was not appraised in 2016, which we had a question for the public, but we'll have a separate valuation. And my real second point was that we have not gone through any exercise with Oregon State or internally to bring any kind of plan to you about any thoughts of how East Tacky Ridge should be managed. Right now, it's not part of the research management platform that has been on the table and been discussed. It could be, it might not be, but that's something that we want to have a full airing with all of you about after we have all been able to take a breath from getting an HCP prepared, going through the legislative session, and getting through today. That's our job for the next few months internally, is to have conversations about East Tacky Ridge.
Well, I haven't discussed it with the land board yet. So I'm not prepared to discuss it here today until I get some direction about what they want to do. And as Jeff said, we've been far too busy with other things, so we kept putting it on the back burner, but it's now coming to the top. I also want to remind you that it is 3:50. We haven't done the financial analysis process that Sir Paul wanted to get to today. So we should probably, and I agree with Peter, East Hackey Ridge is going to involve a lengthy conversation, but I need some time with my land board members first.
I just want to say briefly, thank you for this presentation, the grid with the dates and the topics and et cetera. It's very helpful. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Anything else, Jeff? And then I think on the financial stuff, I think we've hit it at the level of specificity, and we had checked in with folks. So I think we're good on that topic for purposes of today's meeting. Noting the time, I think we've got 3 questions that came in via 3 or 4. So Maria, yours was fairly in-depth, and we'll look for an opportunity to either respond via email or a discussion. Diane and Francis will try to address those. I think, Francis, we got yours. Diane will quickly do it with Shannon. And then I have Francis and Bob for public comment for a couple of minutes each. So Shannon, if you're able to repeat Diane's question and then quickly address it, and then we'll do 2 public comments, and then we'll wrap up with just a quick set of next steps.
Okay. So Diana's question, will there be a species inventory, insects, plants, birds, animals? If so, who would be the contact person for that? And she has some information to share. So we've got your contact and can reach out to you. And then as far as the species inventory, a lot of this is wrapped into the monitoring plan for the FMP and the Elliott, and includes those biodiversity plots that we were talking about earlier as sort of a foundation of that network. So that's where a lot of that regular monitoring for insects, plants, birds, other species would happen and be built on just based on that foundational monitoring plan.
Thanks. For public comment, Francis, if you want to come off mute and have a couple of minutes. And we may have to just change a setting here real quick. Francis, are you with us? I think it looks like you should be.
Yeah,
there you are. We got you.
Okay, great. Well, I actually had a question as opposed to a public comment. Oh, you want me to start my video? Okay, start video, hopefully. So my question was about the forest management plan and about thinning in the reserves, you know, the west side reserves, as they're now called. And I was wondering if the forest management plan was going to include the prescription for that thinning, such as how many trees will be left per acre, or how to reintroduce diversity into these monoculture plantations. And so is that going to be in the forest management plan, or would that level of detail be done in the biannual operation plans?
That's a great question. So the forest management plan will have the experimental design for that restoration thinning. And so it will lay out the components and the steps for it to happen. The details of what happens where and when and the prescription level, that would happen in the biennial operations plan. Because those thinnings will take place over the course of 20 years as currently projected.
Thanks, Francis.
Okay, thank you.
Up next, Bob Zybeck.
Am I there?
Yep, we got you, Bob.
Okay. First, I'd like to really back up what Paul Smud said. This is really complicated. I was involved with the Clinton plan. I think it's been a disaster for the rural communities and for our forests personally. I think the wildfires are indications of that. And I'm really concerned about the college being capable of carrying out such a complicated plan as you put together. A second concern is the lack of local expertise. I don't know if many of you knew this, but Jerry Phillips was the absolute expert on the Elliott, and he died a few weeks ago on vacation with his family. My dissertation in 2002 included a detailed wildfire history of the Elliott. In '92, I was on a congressional hearing in Coos Bay on marbled murrelet habitat. So that's 30 years of going in circles on this stuff, and that has me concerned. A final note, other than the fire history one, I discussed that in the last meeting. You're just building a firebomb. That's concerning with management plans and snags and so on. But the soil is not 10,000 years old. The Elliott's really steep. The soil is really shallow, and it keeps falling off. Just during the '96 floods, there was over 100 landslides along just the northern boundary of the Elliott. Gould's Lake and other indications are there that the soil regularly falls off right down to spawning gravel. So I think there needs to be more familiarity with the Elliott, and I think you need to follow Paul Smud's advice to talk to local experts such as himself who know the people that can perform these projects, and local experts in the Coos Bay area who've been concerned about offering testimony and just having it ignored and not bothering to participate as a result. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate your input and suggestions. Okay, just briefly by way of next steps and wrap up. We had an advisory committee meeting scheduled for midsummer, so in July. The current thinking is to repurpose that for an FMP meeting because the lion's share of the work at that point in time is going to be focused on the FMP. And then we don't currently have an advisory committee meeting scheduled in September. And because September 1st, that timeframe, the very beginning of September is an important sort of benchmark for many of the draft products, it felt sort of a better use of all of your times to give those of you who aren't directly involved in FMP work additional time this summer, but ask for a little bit more time maybe in early September. And so look for a scheduler for probably the 7th or the 14th for a full advisory committee meeting. We'll then have the draft products and a little more time over the course of the summer to work on the FMP, which is I think where the focus of the energy needs to be. So if you have questions or concerns about that, let us know. In the meantime, just look for the schedulers and try and be as responsive as it can be to those so we don't have to harass you about them. And then finally, thank you. It was an important day and symbolic in both the celebration of the morning and the signing with state leaders. And then your willingness to yet again roll up your sleeves and get into the sort of meat and potatoes of the work. So thanks everybody for your time, energy, and those of you who joined virtually. Eric Farm, especially you. I know as a member of the advisory committee, couldn't be here in person, but we sure appreciate you. And if anything you'd like to say before we wrap up?
No, nothing from here, but just appreciate everybody's all the information today and everybody's hard work.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for the work that you've put in as well. We know there's a lot over the last couple of months, especially. Vicki, anything in closing?
No, just a simple, gracious thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Meeting adjourned.
Peter, I have a couple of quick housekeeping things I want to do. And actually circling back to some of the celebratory stuff. So number one, and Eric, I know that you are not able to be with us here in person, but I do have a signing pen from the governor this morning headed your way. On that note, I want to make sure that advisory committee members who are here and wanted a pen have one. And then I want to make sure, Peter, I'm counting correctly that our advisory committee members who are missing are Eric, Asha, and Mike. Tom, we have one headed your way too. So Tom was accounted for. So those three, that's everyone?
I think that's right. I'll make sure, I'll double check with you.
It counted like 8 times, but I want to make sure that with somebody else. So, okay. So I want to make sure that advisory committee members have that. I also want to make sure, Ted, do you mind putting that thing up on the screen? I want to make sure that as we move forward, it's really common to like be hyper familiar with a bill as soon as it passes because you're so involved in its work. And then 6 months or a year or 2 years go by and you're like, yeah, I'm pretty sure we talked about that, I think. So please don't ever hesitate to shoot me an email, send me a text message, give me a call in the future if you need to circle back to questions about the bill. The last thing I'm going to ask for is a small favor from each of you. That is my work cell phone number up there. I know at least a few of you took some great photographs this morning while there was the ceremonial signing and those sorts of things happening. If you could send some of those my way, that would be great. So photo dump, if you have questions about the bill in the future, and I want to make sure advisory committee members have pens, and that's it. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks. Jeff, one last thing.
Yeah, Vicky is hosting a informal gathering immediately after the meeting, and there's a map to it for each of you. It's and one of these purple tickets is your ticket to a beverage of your choice that they'll take at the bar. But it's outdoors, but sheltered and with heaters. And we'd love to have you join us before you go along on your way, if you can. If you can't, it's no problem. But we sure hope that you can stop by for a little bit.
Thanks, everybody. Meeting adjourned.